My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I've always believed that teaching was more than a profession. It was a calling that chose me before I chose it. Growing up in the small town of Cedar Falls, Iowa, I watched my third-grade teacher, Mrs. Henderson, transform a classroom full of restless 8-year-olds into eager learners who hung on her every word. That's when I knew. That's when the seed was planted deep in my heart, taking root in soil that had been prepared for something greater than myself. I remember standing in front of my bedroom mirror at age 10, holding a worn-out chalkboard eraser, pretending to teach invisible students about the wonders of multiplication tables and the magic hidden within story problems. Even then, I felt it, this burning certainty that education wasn't just about imparting knowledge, but about igniting something eternal within young hearts. If you believe that miracles still happen, or if you've ever experienced something that deeply touched your faith, share your story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue walking this journey of faith together. 23 years later, I found myself standing in room 204 of Riverside High School, the same school where I'd graduated valedictorian with dreams bigger than the cornfields that stretched beyond our town's borders. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd come full circle, returning to nurture the next generation in the very halls where my own dreams had been shaped. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long rectangles of golden warmth across the scuffed linoleum floors. I breathed in the familiar scent of chalk dust and old textbooks, mixed with the faint aroma of cafeteria coffee that somehow managed to permeate every corner of the building. This was my sanctuary, my mission field, my purpose made manifest in desks and whiteboards, and the endless possibility that lived in every empty chair waiting for a student to fill it. I'd spent the summer preparing for this new school year with the same meticulous care that an artist prepares their canvas. Every lesson plan was crafted with intention, every assignment designed not just to meet curriculum standards, but to spark curiosity and wonder. I stayed up late into the August nights, surrounded by stacks of books and colored pens, designing activities that would make American history come alive for my students. I wanted them to feel the weight of the past, to understand how the choices of those who came before us had shaped the world they now inherited. The walls of room 204 bore testament to my dedication. Historical timelines stretched across the back wall, interspersed with inspirational quotes I'd carefully selected and printed on bright cardstock. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing, Edmund Burke's words proclaimed from above the pencil sharpener. Near the door, Maya Angelou's wisdom greeted students as they entered. When we know better, we do better. My desk was positioned strategically in the corner, not as a barrier between myself and my students, but as a launching pad from which I could move freely throughout the room, connecting with each young mind that walked through my door. I'd learned early in my career that teaching happened not from behind a desk, but in the spaces between desks, in the moments when I could crouch down beside a struggling student and whisper encouragement directly into their uncertainty. The supply closet was stocked with materials I'd purchased with my own money, colored pencils for map projects, poster boards for presentations, and enough extra notebooks to ensure that no student would ever be without the tools they needed to succeed. I'd learned to shop the back-to-school sales with the dedication of a professional shopper, stretching my modest teacher's salary to cover not just my own needs, but the gaps I knew existed in many of my students' lives. As August faded into September, I could feel the familiar electricity that preceded each new school year. It was a sensation I'd never grown tired of, this mixture of nervous anticipation and boundless hope that came with fresh possibilities. Each year brought new faces, new stories, new chances to make a difference. Each year, I reminded myself why I'd chosen this path despite the long hours, the modest pay, and the increasing challenges that seemed to multiply with each passing semester. I thought about my own teachers who had shaped me, who had seen potential in a quiet girl from a middle-class family and nurtured it until it bloomed into confidence. Mrs. Henderson, of course, but also Mr. Thompson, who'd taught me to see history as a collection of human stories rather than mere dates and facts. Miss Man Rodriguez, whose passion for literature had opened worlds I never knew existed. They'd planted seeds that took years to bear fruit. And now it was my turn to plant, to water, to tend the garden of young minds that would soon fill my classroom. The previous year had been challenging. Budget cuts had increased class sizes, technology resources were outdated, and the pressure to meet standardized testing benchmarks sometimes felt overwhelming. But I'd weathered those storms because I knew that beyond the administrative requirements and statistical measurements, there was something sacred happening in room 204. Lives were being shaped, futures were being molded, and hope was being cultivated one student at a time. Standing there in my empty classroom on that late August afternoon, with the sunlight slowly shifting from gold to amber as the day drew to a close, I offered up a simple prayer. It wasn't elaborate or theological, just a heartfelt request for wisdom, patience, and the ability to see each student through God's eyes rather than through the lens of test scores and behavioral reports. I had no way of knowing that this year would test every ounce of that faith I'd just offered up. No way of knowing that room 204 would become the backdrop for the most humbling and ultimately transformative experience of my life. No way of knowing that my understanding of calling, purpose, and identity was about to be shattered and rebuilt in ways I could never have imagined. As I turned off the lights and locked the door, I carried with me the same hope that had sustained me for 13 years of teaching, that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to make a difference, to touch lives, to fulfill the calling that had chosen me so many years ago in front of my childhood bedroom mirror. The first few weeks of September unfolded with deceptive normalcy. My fifth period juniors filed into room 204 each day, with the typical mixture of enthusiasm and adolescent reluctance that I'd grown accustomed to over the years. There was Jessica, a quiet girl who always sat in the front row and took meticulous notes in purple ink. Behind her, Marcus bounced his leg nervously while trying to look disinterested, though I'd caught him reading ahead in the textbook more than once. In the back corner, a group of athletes clustered together, their Letterman jackets creating a wall of school pride and teenage bravado. At first glance, this seemed like any other class I'd taught. The usual dynamics were at play, the eager learners leaning forward in their seats, the reluctant participants slumping backward in subtle rebellion, and the vast middle ground of students who could go either way, depending on how effectively I could capture their imagination. But beneath the surface, I began to sense an undercurrent that felt different from previous years. It started with small things, eye rolls that lasted a fraction too long, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I approached, and a general restlessness that seemed to permeate the room like humidity before a storm. The first real sign of trouble came during our unit on the Revolutionary War. I'd spent hours preparing what I thought was an engaging lesson about the Boston Tea Party, complete with visual aids and role-playing activities designed to help students understand the colonist perspective. I'd even brought in loose-leaf tea to let them smell and touch, hoping to create a sensory connection to the historical moment. "So," I said, holding up a handful of the tea leaves, "imagine you're a colonist in 1773. You've been watching British ships unload cargo that you're forced to buy at inflated prices, while having no say in the laws that govern your daily life. How do you think that would feel?" The silence that followed wasn't the thoughtful contemplation I'd hoped for. Instead, it was the kind of silence that feels loaded with unspoken commentary. Finally, Tyler, one of the football players, raised his hand with theatrical slowness. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying just enough respect to avoid being openly disrespectful. "No offense, but this stuff happened like hundreds of years ago. Why does it even matter now?" Before I could respond, Brittany chimed in from the middle of the room. "Yeah, and it's not like we're going to dump tea in the harbor or whatever. Can't we just read about it and take the test?" I felt my carefully planned lesson deflating like a punctured balloon, but I pressed on with the determined optimism that had carried me through countless challenging moments. "Well, that's exactly why we're exploring it this way. The principles of representation and taxation, the idea of standing up against injustice, these themes are still relevant today. Think about—" "But it's boring," came a voice from the back of the room. I couldn't identify exactly who had spoken, but the sentiment hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. The word boring hit me with unexpected force. In 13 years of teaching, I'd dealt with difficult students, administrative challenges, and budget constraints, but I'd always believed that my passion for the subject matter was contagious. I'd always found ways to make history come alive, to help students see themselves in the stories of those who came before us. As the period continued, I found myself fighting an uphill battle for their attention. The role-playing activity fell flat when students participated with obvious reluctance, delivering their lines with the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. The visual aids that had seemed so compelling during my preparation now felt elementary and forced. Even the tea leaves, which had smelled rich and exotic to me, were dismissed with wrinkled noses and comments about weird herbs. The bell rang with what felt like mercy, releasing us all from the tension that had built up in the room like pressure in a closed container. As students filed out, I heard fragments of conversations that confirmed my growing unease. Totally lost up there, trying way too hard. My mom had better teachers when she was here. I stood at my desk, still holding the bag of tea leaves, feeling foolish in a way I hadn't experienced since my first year of teaching. The confidence that had sustained me through over a decade of educating young minds suddenly felt fragile, like ice beginning to crack under unexpected weight. That afternoon, I stayed late grading papers and revising lesson plans, trying to recapture the magic that had once made teaching feel effortless. I pulled out all my tried-and-true activities, the ones that had generated excitement and engagement in years past. But as I looked at them through the lens of today's experience, they suddenly seemed dated and desperate. The following days brought more of the same. My carefully crafted lessons met with increasing resistance, not through open defiance, but through a kind of passive dismissal that was somehow more demoralizing than outright rebellion would have been. Students completed assignments with minimal effort, participated in discussions with barely concealed impatience, and responded to my attempts at engagement with the kind of polite tolerance usually reserved for visiting relatives. I found myself second-guessing every decision. Was this activity too childish? Was I explaining things in a way that talked down to them? Had I somehow lost touch with what spoke to teenagers? The lesson plans that had once flowed from my imagination like water from a spring now felt forced and artificial. The breaking point began to build during our unit on the Civil War. I'd planned an ambitious simulation where students would represent different perspectives from that era: Union soldiers, Confederate soldiers, enslaved people seeking freedom, and civilians caught in the crossfire. It was the kind of immersive learning experience that had always generated powerful discussions and deep understanding in the past. But this class received my announcement of the simulation with barely disguised groans. During the preparation phase, I overheard comments that cut deeper than the students probably realized. "This is so extra," someone whispered. "Why can't she just give us notes like normal teachers?" I heard Ms. Peterson just shows movies in her history class. Each comment was like a small paper cut, not deeply damaging on its own, but collectively creating a wound that wouldn't stop stinging. I began to question not just my methods, but my understanding of my own purpose. Had I been deluding myself about my abilities? Was I the teacher I thought I was? Or was I simply a middle-aged woman desperately trying to connect with a generation that had already moved beyond my reach? The simulation itself became an exercise in polite endurance rather than engaged learning. Students went through the motions without investment, delivering presentations with the same enthusiasm they might show for reading a phone book aloud. The discussions that should have been passionate and thought-provoking fell flat, with long silences punctuated only by my increasingly desperate attempts to generate conversation. As October arrived with its crisp air and changing leaves, I found myself dreading fifth period in a way that felt like betrayal of everything I'd once believed about my calling. The enthusiasm that had once carried me through challenging days was being eroded by a constant stream of small defeats and subtle rejections. I started staying later each evening, not because I had more work to do, but because I was trying to solve a puzzle I couldn't quite identify. What had changed? Was it them, or was it me? Had the world of education shifted while I wasn't looking, leaving me behind with my outdated methods and naive optimism? The storm clouds were gathering, though I didn't yet recognize them for what they were. I thought I was simply dealing with a particularly challenging class, the kind that every teacher encounters eventually. I had no way of knowing that this growing tension was building toward a moment that would shatter everything I thought I knew about myself and my purpose. Standing at the window of room 204 one October afternoon, watching the maple trees shed their brilliant leaves like tears, I whispered a prayer for wisdom and patience. I still believed that with enough effort, enough creativity, enough love, I could reach these students and help them discover the wonder I'd always found in learning. I had no idea how wrong I was about to be proven, and how completely that wrongness would transform my understanding of what it truly means to teach. October 15th. I remember the date because it's carved into my memory with the precision of trauma. The morning had started like any other. Coffee at 6:30, a quick review of lesson plans, and the familiar ritual of arranging desks and writing objectives on the whiteboard. The autumn sunlight slanted through the windows of room 204, creating patterns on the floor that should have been beautiful but somehow felt ominous. Fifth period approached with its usual weight of dread that I'd been carrying for weeks. My lesson for that day was on the Industrial Revolution, and I'd prepared with the desperate creativity of someone trying to save a sinking ship. I'd brought in photographs of factory conditions, primary source documents from child laborers, and even a piece of actual cotton from a local farm to help students understand the human cost of industrial progress. As students filed in, the familiar sounds filled the room, backpacks hitting the floor, chairs scraping against linoleum, the low murmur of conversations that would need to be redirected toward learning. I stood at the front of the room, holding my materials like talismans against the growing resistance I felt from this group. "Good afternoon, everyone," I began with the forced cheerfulness that had become my default armor. "Today we're going to explore how the Industrial Revolution changed not just how things were made, but how people lived, worked, and understood their place in the world." The response was immediate and familiar, eyes glazing over, slouching shoulders, and the subtle but unmistakable signs of mental checkout that had become the norm in this classroom. But I pressed on, determined to break through their indifference through sheer force of will and preparation. I held up the piece of cotton, its white fibers catching the afternoon light. This cotton might look simple, but in 1850, this single piece represented hours of human labor, from the enslaved people who picked it in the fields to the children who worked 14-hour days in textile mills to turn it into fabric. Can you imagine working from dawn to dusk at age 8 or 9? Your small fingers bleeding from handling rough fibers like this. The silence that greeted my question wasn't thoughtful contemplation. It was the silence of collective disengagement. Then Tyler, who had become something of an unofficial spokesperson for the class's resistance, raised his hand with exaggerated politeness. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of false respect that teenagers use when they want to sound compliant while being anything but, I get that it was bad and everything, but that was forever ago. Why are we spending so much time on old stuff when we could be learning about things that actually matter?" Before I could respond, Brittany jumped in from her seat in the third row. "Yeah. My dad says history teachers just talk about depressing old things because they can't handle teaching about the real world." The comment hit me like a physical blow, not just because of its content, but because of the casual cruelty with which it was delivered. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, but I tried to maintain my composure. "Well, Brittany, understanding the past helps us make sense of the present, the working conditions we enjoy today, the rights we take for granted. They all came from people who understood that progress requires, but it's so boring," came a voice from the back of the room. This time I could see it was Jake, one of the baseball players, who had spoken without even raising his hand. "We get it. Things used to be hard. Now they're not. Can we move on?" A ripple of muffled laughter spread through the classroom like a contagion. I felt my carefully constructed lesson plan crumbling in my hands like the cotton fibers I was still holding. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to continue. "I understand that connecting with historical periods can be challenging, but—" "No offense, Miss Mitchell," Tyler interrupted, his voice carrying a mock sympathy that was somehow worse than outright hostility. But maybe you're just not good at making it interesting. My friend has Mr. Davis for history, and he says his class is actually fun." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Around the room, I could see students exchanging glances, some looking uncomfortable at Tyler's bluntness, others nodding in agreement. The careful balance I'd been trying to maintain between authority and approachability suddenly shifted, and I found myself exposed in a way that felt terrifyingly vulnerable. "Maybe she should try teaching elementary school instead," came another voice. This one from Madison in the front row, a student I'd thought was actually engaged. Kids that age might actually think this stuff is cool. The laughter that erupted this time wasn't muffled or polite. It was open, loud, and directed squarely at me. Students who had maintained at least the pretense of respect suddenly felt permission to express their disdain openly. The sound filled room 204 like water filling a sinking ship, drowning out my ability to think clearly. "That's enough," I said, but my voice came out weaker than I'd intended, lacking the authority I'd always taken for granted. The laughter continued, growing bolder with each passing second. "I mean, seriously," Tyler continued, apparently emboldened by the response from his audience. "My mom had better teachers when she went here, and that was like 20 years ago. Maybe it's time to retire or something." The comment was like a knife between my ribs, cutting through 13 years of dedication and purpose with surgical precision. I felt my hand begin to tremble slightly as I set down the cotton and the photographs I'd so carefully prepared. The room felt like it was spinning slightly, the familiar walls of my sanctuary suddenly feeling like prison bars. "Please," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Let's try to focus on the lesson." But it was too late. The floodgates had opened, and the politeness that had been barely containing their disdain had evaporated completely. Comments began flying from different corners of the room. "This is literally the worst class ever. I'm definitely switching out next semester. Does she even know what she's doing? My little sister could teach this better." Each comment was like another stone thrown at my already cracking foundation. I stood at the front of the classroom, still holding my carefully prepared materials, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. These weren't just criticisms of my methods. They were personal attacks on my competence, my worth, my very identity as an educator. The worst part was seeing the faces of the students who weren't participating in the cruel chorus. Some looked uncomfortable, even sympathetic, but none spoke up in my defense. They sat in silence, either too shocked or too afraid to interrupt the mob mentality that had taken over their classmates. I tried one more time to regain control. "I know these topics might seem removed from your daily lives, but just stop," Brittany said, her voice carrying a finality that cut through my words like a blade. "You're embarrassing yourself." The words hit me with such force that I actually took a step backward. My eyes filled with tears that I desperately tried to blink away, but it was too late. I could feel my face burning with shame, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. The classroom fell into a sudden, terrible silence as students realized they had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. They could see the tears I was trying so hard to hide, could witness the moment when their teacher, the adult who was supposed to be in charge, became just another vulnerable human being crumbling under the weight of their collective cruelty. That silence was somehow worse than the laughter had been. It was the silence of victory, the hush that follows a battle when the defeated party has finally been broken. I stood there, exposed and humiliated, while 32 pairs of teenage eyes watched me fall apart. Without another word, I gathered my materials with shaking hands and walked toward the door. I couldn't look at any of them, couldn't bear to see whether their expressions held satisfaction or regret. All I knew was that I needed to get out of room 204 before I completely lost whatever dignity I had left. I made it to the teacher's lounge before the dam finally burst. Collapsing into the worn armchair in the corner, I buried my face in my hands and sobbed with a grief that went deeper than professional embarrassment. I wasn't just crying for the humiliation I'd just endured. I was mourning the death of everything I'd thought I was, everything I'd believed about my purpose and my calling. For 13 years, I'd been Sarah Mitchell, the teacher who could reach any student, who could make history come alive, who had been called to transform lives through education. In the space of 15 devastating minutes, all of that had been stripped away, leaving me with a question that felt like it might destroy me. Who was I, if I wasn't the teacher I'd always believed myself to be? The days following the classroom incident blurred together like watercolors in the rain. I somehow managed to finish out the rest of that terrible Tuesday, mechanically going through the motions of my remaining classes while feeling like I was watching someone else's life through a fog. My 6th and 7th period students seemed to sense that something was wrong. They were unusually quiet, almost tentative, as if they could smell the destruction that had occurred in 5th period. That evening, I sat in my small apartment on Elm Street, staring at the stack of papers that needed grading while feeling completely incapable of picking up a pen. The silence of my living room felt oppressive after years of finding solace in the quiet moments between school days. Usually, this was when I recharged, when I planned tomorrow's lessons and reflected on the day's small victories. But tonight, there was nothing but the echo of cruel laughter and the memory of feeling utterly powerless in my own classroom. The worst part wasn't even the humiliation itself. It was the way it had stripped away the foundation of my identity with such surgical precision. I'd built my entire sense of self around being an effective teacher, someone who could connect with students and inspire them to love learning. In 15 devastating minutes, that edifice had crumbled, leaving me staring at the rubble and wondering who I was underneath it all. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie awake in my bed, replaying the scene over and over, analyzing every moment for clues about what I could have done differently. Should I have been stricter from the beginning? Had I been too eager to be liked instead of respected? Was I really as out of touch as they'd suggested? The questions circled in my mind like vultures, picking at the carcass of my professional confidence. The physical symptoms began almost immediately. My stomach churned constantly, making it nearly impossible to eat. My hands developed a slight tremor that became more pronounced whenever I thought about facing 5th period again. Dark circles appeared under my eyes, and colleagues began to comment on how tired I looked. "You okay, Sarah?" asked Janet, the veteran math teacher who'd become something of a mentor to me over the years. We were standing in the copy room on Thursday morning, surrounded by the familiar hum of machines and the chemical smell of toner. "I'm fine," I lied, focusing intently on feeding papers into the copier to avoid meeting her concerned gaze. "Just tired." But Janet had been teaching for 28 years, and she could read the signs of a teacher in crisis. "You know, honey, some years are just harder than others. Some classes, well, they can really test what you're made of." Her kindness almost undid me right there in the copy room. I blinked hard, fighting back tears that seemed constantly ready to spill. Have you ever had a class that made you question everything? That made you wonder if you were ever actually good at this job? Janet's expression softened. "Oh, sweetheart, every teacher has that class, the one that breaks you down before it builds you back up. The question is whether you'll let it defeat you or teach you something you didn't know you needed to learn." But her words, meant to be comforting, only highlighted how deep my wounds went. This wasn't just about a difficult class anymore. It was about the terrifying possibility that I'd been deluding myself for 13 years about my abilities and purpose. 5th period became a daily ordeal of endurance. I'd spend the entire morning dreading it, watching the clock with the anxiety of someone awaiting execution. When the time finally came, I'd walk into room 204 feeling like I was entering hostile territory. The students seemed to sense my diminished authority immediately. While they didn't repeat the open cruelty of that Tuesday, their behavior became a subtle form of torture, talking through my lessons, completing assignments with minimal effort, responding to my questions with barely concealed impatience. Tyler, who had been the ringleader of my humiliation, now treated me with a kind of pitying condescension that was almost worse than his previous cruelty. He'd answer my questions with exaggerated patience, as if he were the adult humoring a confused child. "Sure, Mrs. Mitchell," he'd say, when I asked him to read a passage aloud, his tone implying that he was doing me a tremendous favor. The other classes began to feel the impact too. Word had apparently spread about what had happened in 5th period, and I could see it in the way students looked at me, with less respect, more skepticism about my competence. My 7th period, which had always been engaged and participatory, became quieter and more reserved. They were still polite, but the easy rapport we'd built over the first month of school had been damaged by my diminished reputation. I started avoiding the teacher's lounge, unable to bear the thought of normal conversations about lesson plans and weekend activities when I felt like such a fraud. Instead, I ate lunch alone in my classroom, grading papers with mechanical precision, while trying not to think about how far I'd fallen from the enthusiastic educator I'd once been. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks after the incident. I'd just finished a particularly difficult 5th period where my attempts to discuss the progressive era had been met with the usual mixture of disengagement and barely veiled contempt. As students filed out, I heard Madison whisper to her friend, "And I feel kind of bad for her. She's trying so hard, but she's just not good at this." The comment, delivered with what was probably intended as sympathy, hit me harder than any of the previous cruelty. There was something about being pitied that felt worse than being mocked. It confirmed what I'd been trying not to admit to myself, that I really had lost whatever magic I'd once possessed as an educator. That evening, I found myself in my car in the parking lot of Cedar Falls Community Church, the small Methodist congregation where I'd been a member since returning to town. I hadn't intended to come here. I'd been driving aimlessly, trying to escape the suffocating walls of my apartment and the weight of my failure. But somehow, my car had found its way to this familiar place. The building was empty, except for Pastor Williams, who was leaving after what looked like a late meeting. He noticed me sitting in my car and walked over, his face creased with concern. "Sarah, everything all right?" I rolled down my window, and before I could stop myself, the words came tumbling out. "Pastor, I think I've made a terrible mistake. I thought God had called me to teach, but what if I was wrong? What if I've been fooling myself all these years?" He leaned down, his weathered hands resting on my car door. "Want to come inside and talk about it?" 20 minutes later, I was sitting in his office, surrounded by shelves of theological books and the gentle glow of a desk lamp, telling him everything. The humiliation, the loss of confidence, the growing certainty that I'd been living a lie about my abilities and calling. "I've always believed that teaching was more than a job for me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I thought it was my ministry, my way of serving God. But what if I was just being proud? What if I convinced myself I was called because it made me feel special?" Pastor Williams listened without interrupting, his kind eyes reflecting the pain in mine. When I finally finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah," he said gently, "calling isn't about being immune to failure or criticism. Some of the most faithful people in Scripture faced moments when they questioned everything they thought they knew about their purpose. Moses felt inadequate. Jeremiah tried to refuse his mission. And even John the Baptist sent messengers to ask Jesus if he was really the one they'd been waiting for. "But they were prophets," I protested. "I'm just a high school history teacher who can't even control her classroom." "You're a child of God who's been wounded," he replied. "That doesn't disqualify you from your calling. It just means you're human." His words were kind, but they felt hollow against the weight of my certainty that I had been exposed as a fraud. As I drove home that night through the empty streets of Cedar Falls, I couldn't shake the feeling that my crisis went deeper than just professional disappointment. It felt like a spiritual reckoning, a confrontation with the possibility that everything I'd built my identity on was crumbling. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed in the darkness of my small bedroom, listening to the October wind rattle the windows. The enthusiasm that had once carried me through difficult days was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness that felt like grief. I was mourning not just my reputation or my confidence, but the loss of the person I'd thought I was. "God," I whispered into the darkness, "if you're there, if you ever cared about me at all, please show me something. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I feel so lost." The silence that followed felt complete and final. I'd reached out in desperation, hoping for some sign, some comfort, some indication that my years of faithfulness had meant something. But there was nothing, just the sound of wind and the crushing weight of my own inadequacy. I had no way of knowing that in the depth of that valley, in the complete darkness of my despair, grace was already moving toward me with the quiet certainty of dawn. The night of November 3rd started like so many others had in recent weeks, with me sitting on the edge of my bed, staring into the darkness and wrestling with questions that seemed to have no answers. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed 2:47 a.m., but sleep felt as distant as the moon visible through my bedroom window. The weight of failure had become my constant companion, a heavy presence that made even breathing feel labored. I'd reached a place beyond tears, beyond anger, beyond even the desperate hope that tomorrow might somehow be different. This was deeper than professional disappointment. It was a spiritual wilderness where all the landmarks I'd once trusted had disappeared, leaving me completely lost. The apartment was silent except for the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. In that profound quiet, I found myself speaking into the darkness with an honesty born of complete desperation. "Jesus," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. "And if you still care about me at all, if any of this has ever meant anything to you, please show me something. I can't do this anymore. I don't know who I am. I don't know what I'm supposed to be." The words felt like they fell into an empty well, disappearing without echo or response. I'd prayed countless prayers over the years, grateful prayers, requesting prayers, intercessory prayers for my students, but this was different. This was the prayer of someone who had reached the absolute end of herself, who had nothing left to offer but naked need. I sat there for several minutes, wrapped in my old terry cloth robe, feeling foolish for expecting anything different. The silence felt complete, confirming what I'd begun to suspect, that I was truly alone in my crisis, that whatever connection I'd thought I had with the divine had been as illusory as my belief in my teaching abilities. But then, something began to shift in the atmosphere of the room. It started so subtly that I almost missed it. A change in the quality of the silence, as if the air itself had become somehow denser, more present. There was no sound, no visible alteration in my small bedroom. But suddenly, I was aware that I was no longer alone. The emptiness that had felt so crushing just moments before was being filled with something I couldn't name but couldn't deny. The presence was gentle, but unmistakable, like warmth spreading through cold water. I lifted my head slowly, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter whatever was happening. And that's when I saw him. Jesus stood near my bedroom window, backlit by the pale moonlight filtering through the curtains. But the light wasn't coming from outside. It was emanating from him, soft and golden, like sunrise captured in human form. There was nothing theatrical about his appearance. No blinding radiance or overwhelming display of power. He was simply there, as real and solid as the furniture in my room, yet carrying an otherworldly peace that immediately stilled every anxious thought in my mind. His face was kind in a way that went beyond human kindness. It was kindness that knew every failure, every shame, every secret wound I carried, and loved me not despite them but through them. His eyes held depths of understanding that no earthly counselor could possess. And when those eyes met mine, I felt seen in a way that was both terrifying and healing. He didn't speak with audible words, but I heard him clearly, not with my ears, but with something deeper than hearing. The voice resonated in my heart, in my bones, in the very core of my being. "Sarah," he said, and my name had never sounded more beautiful or more important. "You are not what they said about you. You are not your failures or your successes. You are not your performance or your reputation. You are mine." The simple words shattered something in me that had been holding back a flood. But instead of the bitter tears I'd grown accustomed to, what came was something cleaner, something that felt like release rather than despair. I wept, but it was the weeping of someone whose deepest wound was finally being tended. I don't understand," I managed to whisper. "I thought I was called to teach, but I'm failing so badly. I thought I was serving you, but I can't even manage a classroom of teenagers." His expression was infinitely patient, like a father listening to a beloved child wrestle with concepts too big for their understanding. Your calling has never been about their approval or your success. It has been about love, about showing up, about being faithful in small things even when no one notices or appreciates. As he spoke, images began flooding my mind. Not visions exactly, but memories illuminated with new understanding. I saw Jessica, the quiet girl in the front row, who had told me after class one day that my encouragement had helped her find the courage to speak up in other classes. I saw Marcus, the nervous leg bouncer, who had stayed after school to ask questions about college applications because he trusted me enough to share his dreams. I saw moments I'd forgotten or dismissed, tiny interactions where love had been given and received without fanfare or recognition. But they hate my classes, I protested. They think I'm boring and irrelevant. They were right when they said I should quit. Child, his voice carried gentle rebuke mixed with boundless tenderness. And when did their opinion become more important than mine? When did you start measuring your worth by the approval of those you're meant to serve, rather than by the faithfulness of your service? The question cut through years of accumulated insecurity and people-pleasing with surgical precision. I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd transferred my need for validation from God to my students, making their approval the measure of my calling, rather than trusting in the one who had called me. I've been so proud, I admitted, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. I thought I was this great teacher who could reach anyone, who could inspire everyone. When they rejected me, it destroyed everything I thought I was. Pride often masquerades as calling, he said with infinite gentleness. But true calling isn't about your abilities. It's about my love working through your willingness. It's not about being remarkable. It's about being faithful. As we sat together in that holy silence, for somehow I knew he had joined me on the edge of my bed, though I couldn't see him there, I began to understand that my crisis hadn't been about losing my calling. It had been about discovering what my calling truly was. All these years, I'd been trying to be the kind of teacher who could transform lives through charisma and skill. But what God wanted was simply someone who would show up with love, regardless of the response. What am I supposed to do now? I asked. How do I go back to room 204 after everything that's happened? The same way I went to the cross after being rejected and mocked, he replied. With love. Not because they deserve it, not because you'll be appreciated for it, but because love is who you are in me. The comparison took my breath away, not because I was comparing myself to Christ, but because he was showing me that rejection and misunderstanding were not signs of failure, but opportunities for faithfulness. He had been mocked, dismissed, and ultimately crucified by the very people he came to save, yet he had never wavered in his love for them. I'm so afraid, I confessed. What if I fail again? What if I really am as incompetent as they think? Then you'll fail in love rather than in pride, he said, and I'll be with you in the failure just as surely as I'm with you in the success. Your identity isn't teacher, Sarah. Your identity is beloved daughter. Everything else is just how you express that identity. We remained together as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky outside my window. I don't know how long we sat in that sacred space, but time seemed irrelevant in the presence of eternal love. He didn't give me a formula for fixing my classroom problems, or a strategy for winning back my students' respect. Instead, he gave me something infinitely more valuable, the unshakable knowledge that I was loved not for what I did, but for who I was in him. As the presence began to fade with the growing light, I felt not abandoned, but equipped. The room gradually returned to its ordinary appearance, but I was fundamentally changed. The fear was still there, the uncertainty about returning to school, the memory of humiliation, but underneath it all was a foundation that couldn't be shaken by teenage cruelty or professional disappointment. I was his. That simple truth had become more real to me than any earthly identity or achievement. Whatever happened in room 204, whatever challenges awaited me, I would face them not as Sarah Mitchell, the failed teacher, but as Sarah Mitchell, the beloved daughter who happened to teach. For the first time in weeks, I slept peacefully, cradled in the certainty that I was known, loved, and equipped for whatever lay ahead. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of early November Tather, and for the first time in weeks, I woke up without the familiar knot of dread in my stomach. The encounter 3 nights earlier had left me fundamentally changed, not in any external way that others might notice, but in the deep places where identity and purpose take root. I was still Sarah Mitchell, still a high school history teacher in Cedar Falls, Iowa, still facing the same challenging class that had nearly broken me. But I was no longer facing them alone, and more importantly, I was no longer measuring my worth by their response to me. As I prepared for school that morning, I found myself moving with a quiet confidence that felt entirely new, yet somehow familiar. Like returning to a path I'd walked long ago but had forgotten. I dressed in my favorite blue sweater, not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because it made me feel comfortable in my own skin. I prepared my lesson on the progressive era with care, not because I was desperate to prove my competence, but because the stories of people who had worked for justice and change in difficult circumstances suddenly felt deeply relevant to my own journey. Walking into Riverside High School, I noticed details that had been obscured by my recent preoccupation with failure. The way morning sunlight slanted through the main hallway windows, the sound of students laughing together at their lockers, the familiar smell of coffee from the main office. These weren't just background elements of my workplace. They were part of the daily miracle of young lives intersecting, growing, becoming who they were meant to be. I was privileged to be part of that process, regardless of whether they appreciated my role. 5th period approached without its usual weight of impending doom. I still felt nervous. I wasn't naive enough to think that my internal transformation would immediately change the classroom dynamics. But it was the kind of nervousness that comes with anticipation, rather than dread. As I arranged my materials on the desk, I whispered a simple prayer: "Help me love them well," regardless of how they respond. The students filed in with their typical Monday morning energy, and I could see some of them glancing at me curiously, as if trying to detect whether anything had changed. Tyler took his usual seat near the back, surrounded by his athletic friends. Brittany settled into her 3rd-row desk with the practiced air of someone who had already decided not to be impressed. Jessica, as always, sat in the front row with her purple pen ready. "Good morning, everyone," I said, and my voice carried a warmth that surprised even me. It wasn't forced cheerfulness or desperate enthusiasm. It was simply genuine gladness to be there with them, regardless of what the next 50 minutes might bring. Today we're going to explore a period when ordinary people decided that they couldn't accept the status quo anymore. They saw problems, corruption in government, dangerous working conditions, inequality that seemed impossible to overcome. And instead of just complaining about it, they rolled up their sleeves and got to work. I paused, looking around the room at faces that had become so familiar over the past 2 months. Some were already showing signs of the usual disengagement. But instead of feeling defensive, I found myself feeling genuine affection for these complicated, struggling, amazing young people who were trying to figure out their place in the world. "I know some of you have been wondering if history really matters," I continued, and I could see Tyler shift slightly in his seat. And honestly, I've been wondering the same thing lately. Not about whether the past is important, but about whether the way I've been teaching it has been helping you understand why it should matter to you. The honesty in my admission seemed to catch them off guard. For the first time in weeks, I had their full attention. Not because I was trying to entertain them, but because I was speaking to them as real people with real concerns. So let me try something different today. Instead of starting with dates and names, let's start with a question. What would you change about the world if you could? What makes you angry enough that you'd be willing to work really hard to fix it? The silence that followed wasn't the dead silence of disengagement. It was the alive silence of minds actually thinking. Slowly, tentatively, hands began to rise. Jessica spoke first. "I hate how people get bullied online and nobody does anything about it." Marcus, surprising everyone including himself, raised his hand. "I think it's unfair that some kids can't go to college just because their families don't have money." Even some of the students who had been most resistant began to engage. Madison mentioned her concern about environmental problems. Jake talked about how hard it was for his grandfather to afford his medications. As they shared, I found myself seeing them not as obstacles to overcome or audiences to impress, but as young people genuinely grappling with real concerns about justice and fairness and making a difference in the world. These were the same hearts that had moved the progressive era reformers, the same passion for change that had driven people to fight for women's suffrage, workers' rights, and social justice. Now, I said, when the conversation had built some momentum, let me tell you about some people who felt exactly the same way you do. Except they were living in 1900. They saw problems that seemed too big to solve, systems that seemed too powerful to change, but they decided to try anyway. For the next 40 minutes, I told them stories, not about abstract historical forces, but about individual people who had decided to act on their convictions despite facing ridicule, opposition, and failure. I told them about Jane Addams, who was criticized for working with immigrants and the poor, about Ida B. Wells, who risked her life to expose lynching despite threats and hatred, about Frances Willard, who was mocked for believing that women deserved a voice in society. These people weren't successful because they were popular, I said, as the period drew to a close. Most of them were criticized, rejected, even threatened for their beliefs. They were successful because they were faithful to what they believed was right, even when it was difficult. The bell rang. But instead of the usual stampede toward the door, students lingered. Several came up to ask questions or make connections between the historical figures and modern issues. Tyler, to my amazement, stopped by my desk on his way out. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, and his voice carried none of its usual condescension. That was actually pretty interesting. I mean, I never thought about how those old people were kind of like activists today. After he left, I sat alone in room 204, marveling at what had just happened. Not because it had been a perfect class. There were still students who had seemed disengaged, still moments of awkwardness and uncertainty. But for the first time in weeks, I had been fully present with my students instead of being preoccupied with my own performance. I had loved them well, regardless of their response, and somehow that had created space for authentic learning to happen. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete. Over the following weeks, there were still difficult days, still moments when old insecurities crept back in, still students who remained resistant to my attempts to connect. But something fundamental had shifted in how I approached each day. I was no longer teaching from a place of desperate need for validation, but from a quiet confidence in my identity as God's beloved daughter who happened to teach history. The change affected more than just fifth period. My other classes began to respond to the authenticity they sensed in me. Colleagues commented on how I seemed more relaxed, more myself. Even my grading became an act of service rather than drudgery. Each student paper was an opportunity to encourage, to challenge, to speak life into a young person's developing understanding of the world. One afternoon in late November, as I was cleaning the whiteboard after my last class, Jessica approached my desk hesitantly. "Ms. Mitchell," she said quietly, "I just wanted to thank you." "For what, sweetie?" "For not giving up on us. I know we were really mean to you, especially Tyler and that group, but you kept trying to help us learn, even when we didn't deserve it. It made me think about how I treat people when they're trying to help me." Her words were a gift I hadn't expected, a small sign that faithfulness in love really did matter, even when it wasn't immediately appreciated. But more importantly, her gratitude wasn't what gave my teaching meaning. It was simply a bonus blessing along the way. As December arrived with its promise of winter break and new beginnings, I found myself preparing lessons with the same care and creativity I'd always brought to teaching, but with a foundation that couldn't be shaken by difficult days or challenging students. I was teaching not because I needed to prove my worth, but because I had been called to love young people by helping them understand their place in the ongoing story of human struggle and hope. Room 204 had become sacred space again, not because every class was perfect, but because it was where I learned to live out my identity as beloved daughter in the practical, daily work of serving others. Every morning when I unlocked that door, I carried with me the unshakable knowledge that I was exactly where God wanted me to be, doing exactly what He had equipped me to do. The humiliation that had once seemed like the end of my story had become the place where my real story began. The story of a woman who learned that true calling isn't about being remarkable, but about being faithful in love, one day at a time. Dear listeners, we hope Sarah Mitchell's story touched your heart. If you'd like to keep experiencing powerful stories like this, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Every day we share stories that reveal the depth of life and the human heart. We'll be waiting for you in the comments.